Up until this point, I've been kind of avoiding talking about the entire Russian Ukrainian situation because, quite frankly, I've considered all the information I've been getting to be of such poor quality that it's hard to even gauge what exactly is going on there. Uh, as always, it's probably easiest to see some historical examples to kind of understand what it is we're actually seeing here. Uh, Gives us some context of understanding the actual conflict that's currently in place. So, bring up Chechnya first. For those of you unfamiliar with it, uh, Chechnya was a region of Russia. Unlike the other Soviet republics like Georgia or Azerbaijan or Ukraine or Belarus and places like that, this was considered to be an integral part of Russia itself. Uh, Significant ethnic differences between Russians and Chechens. One issue that's continuously cropping up and will always crop up in the former regions of this what was the Soviet Union is the Russians at all points, even prior to the Soviet Union and definitely during, practiced uh, basically repopulating areas with Russians. Their goal was to Russify everything in order to bring stability. Same case in Chechnya. Chechnya had a big difference is that it is 95% Muslim. Uh, Chechnya ended up fighting two wars against Russia. The first one, they fought to a standstill. Essentially, they declared independence. The Russians decided to come in and force them back into Russia. And you'll see a lot of interesting parallels between things they say are going on in Ukraine and Chechnya. Uh, Instances of units of Russian conscripts being put into situations where they should have completely outmatched their the Chechens they're up against in terms of manpower and weapons, and you had units taking 90% losses. And the first Chechnyan War was a pretty major bruising to the Russians. Russians took pretty brutal casualties. They were also uh, kind of old timey in their way of going pursuing this war against Chechnya. Ultimately, what would happen is they would sign an agreement. Chechnya, depending on whose side you view, essentially became a kind of a nest of terrorist organizations spilling in from other world conflicts, Mujahideen and other things like that coming in. And eventually, this problem was starting to spill over the borders, and the Russians declared war once again. Well, they didn't declare war, they called it essentially an operation to restore order. And this time they came in and pounded the crap out of the country. They hammered on cities. They didn't. They were pretty indiscriminate. Didn't particularly care what the civilian casualties they were causing, and ultimately they force reintegrated Chechnya back into Russia. Uh, but the key takeaways here is that first reason why Chechnya is different from Georgia or Ukraine is Chechnya was always, or at least for a very long time, an integral part of Russia, whereas Georgia and Ukraine were seen as distinct entities that were in some form of federation with the various Russian entities, the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Uh, the Russians were fully willing to take very brutal casualties in order to institute the takeover or the retakeover of Chechnya, and the fact that they lost the first time out and won on the second round didn't seem to be a major political upending. In fact, if you look at it in terms of what Russia was up against in Chechnya versus what Russia's up against in Ukraine, if the loss of prestige due to a military defeat uh, was going to topple the government or anything like that, you'd think Chechnya would have been the one to do it because they were able to inflict such incredible losses with such a tiny army in comparison. So, talk a little bit about Georgia because some of this starts looking similar. So we have a problem where essentially we have two major regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and you see that third little region to the right, uh, not not always considered part of South Ossetia, and it wasn't in the final takeover areas, as far as my understanding would be. So, big difference between Georgia and Chechnya is Georgia was considered its own thing for quite a while. It was considered a federated state, not part of Russia itself. So when it declared independence initially, although there were some issues in terms of trying to figure out how to work things along the borders, in general, the Georgia was kind of allowed to go its own way. However, it had a government in place that was very friendly to Russia. Now, the thing to understand about South Ossetia and Abkhazia is essentially these are regions that have larger Russian populations, whereas the rest of Georgia is mostly Georgian. These areas have a high percentage of Russians. And for instance, in terms of South Ossetia uh, had an issue even going back to the Soviet Union in terms of it being uh, very separatist in nature. Uh, Essentially, in order to gain peace in the region, Ossetia, north and south, were split in half and basically put into different parts, one into Georgia and one into southern Russia, in order to uh, basically control it better because of a lot of the problems they're having. So what ends up happening is, and a lot of people kind of forget this, is that uh, the whole situation was preceded by the United States uh, issuing a membership action plan for Georgia to join NATO. And essentially, this caused a ratcheting up of tensions. All of a sudden, the separatists in Abkhazia and South Ossetia end up getting Russian weapons. Both areas already had peacekeepers in it. The Russians were considered the neutral party initially, and they had their own peacekeepers in there. Uh, there's some. The general view in the West is the Russians initiated the fighting. There are other parties that would believe that Georgia actually began the operation in hopes of cutting off Ossetia and taking it so quickly that the Russians would have a hard time reacting to it. Uh, Essentially, when the war finally kicked off in full fledged, uh, the Russians stormed in and over the border, pretty much uh, pushing the Georgian units around at will. The Russians pretty much had a goal from the get go that Abkhazia and South Ossetia would become independent units uh, theoretically recognized by Russia as independent nations with strong ties back to Russia. And the rest of the intervention into Georgia itself was primarily a punishment operation designed to destroy the Georgian military and destroy a lot of their infrastructure. And once the war was concluded, the Russians pulled back into the areas of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and technically, by some of the agreements they came up with, they were supposed to pull out and leave them neutral, but they never actually fully left. But they could have fairly easily occupied the rest of Georgia. There was nothing anybody could have done about it. It's very unlikely that the United States or NATO or any other entity would have decided to come to their aid should the Russians had completely occupied them. The most probable reasons for the Russians not occupying Georgia was the fact that they probably didn't want to deal with being occupiers of a hostile nation, which essentially they're dealing with constant insurgencies and other things like that. So they opted to only occupy the areas that actually wanted the Russians to come in there. Also, with Georgia bordering Turkey, it would have been very, very easy for Turkey and any friends of Turkey to run an insurgency, because closing that border would have been very, very difficult. So despite the fact the Russians basically rampaged all over the country at will, they didn't make any particular efforts to enter and occupy urban centers. They did bomb them and drop rockets on them. And they essentially engaged the Georgian military wherever they could find easy pickings and take it out. And once they met the objectives they wanted, they pulled back into those areas, and that is pretty much the state of where things are at today. So, how does this play into what is going on in Ukraine? Well, in terms of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, you have a very similar situation where these areas were heavily populated by Russians, by both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, for the goal of Russifying these areas. Ukraine seemed essentially, you had a government change. That's something I didn't mention in Georgia. The Georgian government had a unexpected coup where the pro-Russian government fell and a pro-Western government rose, and it looked a lot like you had a lot of NGOs, which are just another letter for CIA in most cases, caused that government to fall. And you see a similar thing in Ukraine, where we have a pro-Russian government is overthrown in favor of a Western government, and it was clearly intervention from the West that causes this to happen. And chatter starts coming up about the idea of Ukraine having its membership action plan, its way of coming into NATO. The idea is that people discuss that, oh well, no one ever decided or ever talked about Ukraine becoming part of NATO. Is nonsense. Please do a search on membership action plan for NATO, and you will find that they were considered as one of the nations that they were going to add in, and the combination of talking about bringing Ukraine into NATO and putting a new government in charge that the Russians weren't keen on were a lot towards the destabilization that comes later. And for all the idiots out there, I'm not justifying a Russian invasion. I'm just telling you why they did it. Uh, every country has reasons for the way they do things. It doesn't mean it's right. Any invasion of another country using force is always wrong, period, regardless of what reasons they come up with and regardless of how strongly they believe those reasons. So I believe, and this is what I believed initially, that when the invasion occurred, uh, I believe that the Russians came in with the sole goal of fully liberating the separatist regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, and essentially securing Crimea. Uh, they may have been considering the idea of a corridor to Crimea, but in all honesty, it's not completely necessary. They have the means to supply Crimea via other means. Uh, okay, so what do I think now that this has been going on for this amount of time? I think their goals haven't changed and they never did change. I do believe that their end goal of occupying these separatist regions, declaring them more or less independent entities that probably only Russia and a handful of other countries will recognize, was their sole goal, and I believe it will continue to be their sole goal. And we'll find out soon, I think, because I think we're actually getting to a point where either through the winter or certainly as soon as the countryside firms up after the mud period that comes in spring, essentially we'll see more decisive moves. Uh, every indication, if you look at the initial movement of the Russians, there was the Western media was claiming that Russia was going for Kiev. And really, in all honesty, I mean, if you look at Russia versus Ukraine, you're talking about Russia having 10 times the military with much more modern weapons rolling in to do this. There aren't a whole lot of natural barriers preventing the Russians from getting to Kiev. Uh, in fact, the fact that you had several times where they were showing Russian motorized units rolling through various streets of Kiev shows that they could have, if they really wanted to, probably moved in, surrounded the city, and reduced it if they really wanted to. Uh, it would appear that the Russians weren't interested in engaging in that particular urban combat. Uh, it would have been needlessly expensive in the face of troops in terms of losses, and I suspect they're not any more interested in occupying and holding the rest of Ukraine any more than they were holding on to Georgia for the exact same reasons. One, it's a long term negative to the economy and the military of a country to occupy a hostile area and wear it down over time. And plus of where Ukraine's borders are in relationship to the rest of NATO, supplying an insurgency there would have been ridiculously easy. I don't think the Russians have changed their modus operandi in this case. I think they were essentially doing the exact same thing they were doing to Georgia, coming in, uh, hammering the crap out of the Ukrainian military and infrastructure where they could. I do think they did attempt to decapitate the Kiev government, but I don't think they ever had any intention of trying to occupy Kiev. There are several things that were always very strange at the beginning of this war. Now, if you look at virtually every picture and video that comes out and is shown on the internet and shown on mainstream media, for the most part, you don't see anything that looks like a major formation. Everything is onesie twosies. It's a handful of guys shooting over a wall. It's a handful of guys moving. It's a handful of guys advancing. It's a single artillery piece firing. It's onesie twosie vehicles on the move. And yeah, there are certain circumstances where you would see this, and that would be if you're doing a dispersed defense, which would make sense what Ukraine was doing. However, if you're doing a dispersed defense, you're not massing on the enemy, engaging them, pushing them back, and causing massive casualties on them. You're creating pinpoint defensive pockets that you are trying to essentially get the enemy to basically inflict casualties upon themselves by trying to take. So yeah, I'm not seeing the visual information that backs up the claims that are showing up in the media. Another problem is we see a lot of the vehicles that are showed destroyed are vehicles that are used by both sides. Now, I'm not saying the Russians aren't taking losses, and I think the losses are fairly significant, but I think the Ukrainian losses are probably just as brutal. One of the things we see, it was like they were showing this incredible cleverness of the Ukrainians using off-the-shelf drones to basically prosecute this war, and we started seeing images of like drones showing the footage of a tank or an artillery piece someplace else, and then a precision strike taking it out. Okay, so that's BS. That's not happen. Okay, yes, what's in the picture is Russian and it is being destroyed, but there's no way in heck the Ukrainians are using off-the-shelf drones to direct single hit on target strikes and take things out like that. That has all the hallmarks of U.S. Special Forces. So I think the drone coverage, and they very well may be using it for the initial spotting, but okay, if I saw in the picture of, let's say I saw the drone footage and you see a Russian tank in some kind of concealment off in the distance, and I see a couple of explosions where artillery fire is being walked in and they're using the drone to correct, I would say, yes, you are watching the Ukrainians do something really special here. But when I see a single shot hit, I'm like, nope, that is U.S. Special Forces using satellite imagery, SATCOMs, basically pinpointing things and striking it with high-end munitions. One of the things is that the U.S., because of the way the Russians were massing before this war, the U.S. knew the Russians were coming in. That was a given. If the U.S. knew the Russians were coming in, you can guarantee that U.S. Special Forces were already in Ukraine before the Russians showed up. U.S. Special Forces were probably integrating into the Ukrainian army, probably helping it direct, telling it to disperse, telling it how to conceal, getting it all over the place, because the last thing in the world you would want to do is actually mass a defense against the Russians. So in the early part of the war, we see the Russians seemingly moving at will. There's a lot of video of handfuls of tanks and stuff rolling through Kiev. And then there's the one thing that kind of really sticks out like a sore thumb. There was that period where the Russians kind of had a halt, and they had this massive column of units running into the center of the country. And people kind of forget about this now, but okay, so if the Ukrainians had this incredible ability to attack that they seem to be showing now, they would have waded into that was a massive, huge target for anyone with offensive capabilities. The fact that that column pretty much got left alone tells me that the Ukrainians lacked major offensive capability. Now, yes, they do have, if they've got Western weapons and special forces backing them up, they do have the ability to be brutally annoying. They're probably on par uh, with, essentially to give a comparison, on par with what the United States had to deal with in Vietnam in terms of the Viet Cong. A determined enemy who knows their countryside and has the weapons to inflict damage and basically constantly hits wherever the enemy is not masked. And the fact that the Russians can take huge losses on anything that wanders off a little bit too far also is strong indication that you have U.S. Special Forces present. Okay, Russia is dealing with something it's not used to because of the fact that we had a better idea what they were going to do this time by watching what they did in Georgia. The thing the Russians are dealing with that they don't have a counter to is that the Ukrainians essentially have a massive advantage in terms of intelligence. They know the movements of the Russians probably fairly quickly after they begin moving. And anything that sits too long in too isolated an area ends up getting targeted. Again, that screams U.S. Special Forces. So it's not that, and the Ukrainians are putting up a pretty tenacious fight. I mean, they didn't roll over and buckle, but it's not the Ukrainians' tenacity alone that's causing the problems for the Russians. It's information dominance, and it's information dominance via the U.S. Okay. So I do think the Russians are taking fairly large losses. But if you look at Chechnya, that's not particularly unusual for them. It's not something that's freaking out their military. It's not probably causing as much problems for the Russian leadership as Western media is making it out to be. I do think Russia is experiencing some problems in terms that its military industrial complex was not expecting a real war and was engaging in massive fraud. So there's a lot of situations where military equipment was not kept up properly. Protective gear meant to go to the soldiers is in fact not truly protective gear. It's mock-ups of protective gear. But guarantee as we speak, the people who committed the fraud are probably in prison or dead, and that the people who are taking over for them are going to equip the new recruits coming out in a much better fashion. One thing that Ukraine does have in terms of in the separatist regions in the Donbass is Ukraine has had essentially irregular forces trained by the CIA operating there since 2014. These guys have an incredible amount of experience and ability in holding positions for a long time and then knowing when to pull out and be a nuisance. So I think Russia is experiencing some problems there. And obviously, Western weapons do make a huge impact. But in the long run, Russia's proximity, Russia's population will ultimately allow Russia to engage this war the way they want to. I would assume that Okay, one of the things to understand about the region, if you know anything about World War II, is you have two periods, but one in the fall, one in the spring, essentially known as the mud season. Essentially, it's where the whole countryside just turns to muck. And during that time period, essentially your motorized and armored forces become road bound, assuming you even have sufficient roads to move things down. So, this period where supposedly the Ukrainians are advancing rapidly and taking all these territories back, I don't think they have the offensive capability to actually do that. My guess is the Russians are probably retrenching back into the areas that they intend to hold. Because if everything was road bound during that mud period, it would have been really, really easy to prevent the Ukrainians from advancing, no matter how bad a state the Russian military might be in. So my guess, based on what I've been reading, is the Russians are probably setting up winter lines, or have set up winter lines, giving an opportunity for, obviously they're going to push some of the recruits directly into the front line, but they're probably also training a lot of the guys to the rear, and they're going to wait until the post-mud season of the spring to bring these guys to force, to basically bring Russia to its ultimate objectives. So the big thing to be looking for is, so if our Western media has been reporting truthfully and their understanding of the situation is correct, either now as the ground is freezing, or immediately after the mud is done in the spring, the Ukrainians should be launching massive offensives and be able to push the Russians out of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. In fact, if Russia is in such bad shape right now as it supposedly is, a winter offensive would be exactly the right thing to do. The ground would be frozen, basically being able to attack anywhere rather than being road bound would be hugely advantageous to the Ukrainians. The fact, if you see that all the advances pretty much come to a halt or a crawl, or basically the media, is constantly talking about how like the edges of the city are being taken over, but the city never really seems to get taken over, it means no Ukrainian winter offensive is actually happening. So I think we'll see the major move occur in the spring. If the Russians are pushed out of these areas, yeah, then everything we've heard in the media was absolutely correct. However, if it ends up that the Donbass separatist regions and Crimea are still in Russian hands and some sort of ceasefire comes into effect, you'll hear the Western media claim victory that, oh, the Russians tried to take over the whole country, but the plucky Ukrainians pushed them all the way back to these areas. That's where I'll call BS and say, no, that's exactly what the Russians were planning to do the whole time. And the rest of your commentary was essentially a Punch and Judy show for over the last year. So that's my take on what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. And it'll be interesting to see the outcome of this. I would like to see Ukraine back in control of all of its own territory. It just doesn't seem terribly likely. So, we have the comment section below. What do you think? Do you think Russia was planning on taking over all of Ukraine? Or are they just interested in holding on to the Crimea and taking the separatist regions into Donbass? Do you think the Russians are in as bad a shape as what Western media seems to make them out to be? Do you think the Russians have the wherewithal to grunt it out like they did in Chechnya over a long period of time? Or do you think they no longer have the will to perform those kind of battles or long-term wars? Yeah, tell me below. I'm interested in your thoughts. Well, please smash the like button. If there's somebody out there you think might find this interesting, please share it with them. And if you've stumbled across this, please consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you for spending time with me tonight. Hope to see you again in a future video.